Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Today we are talking about knots on the podcast, and this is an installment in the Cast1 podcast series, a subset of episodes within the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast library that focuses on the essentials. Now, don't log off, don't click away if you've been fly fishing for a long time. And here's a few reasons why. I'm talking about good knots, I'm talking about bad knots. And bad knots are things that every one of us deal with, regardless of how long you have been fishing. And so I'm going to walk through what I mean by bad knots here in a minute. But first, I'm going to talk about good knots. And this may very well be something somewhat controversial. I'm not intending to be controversial. I'm not looking to start trouble within my listeners. But I'm going to lay out what I believe the best knot is for every situation, and maybe what a second knot is, a backup knot, or maybe a knot if you want to spend a whole lot of time on the stream side. I'm going to talk about knots. Now, knots, you need knots. So if you are a new angler, I'm going to give you a list of knots that are worth learning, and a bunch of knots that are probably that you have to use if you're going to fish. Now, simply making overhand knot after overhand knot is not the way to tie on your size 22 dry fly. It's not going to work. And so it's important to have the right knots. Along those same lines, there's a few things that you need to know. First of all, a podcast is not the way to learn about knots comprehensively. Although I may be offering a primer and an introduction for new and experienced anglers, this is not the best way to get all the information you need. Hopefully, like I do very frequently on the podcast, I'm giving you enough information that you can go online, go to a book that you have, and try it yourself. I actually think that when it comes to learning knots, the best thing you can do is use a picture and a series of pictures. So almost like comic book panels. You can find this in fishing books. You can find this online. I think that the videos are good, but far too often the videos are done with poor camera work. I think that the animated knot videos are also excellent. So I would say that having the pictures on hand and then also having an animated video or a very well videoed internet video are all helpful things. And if you're using a video, don't be afraid to hit that pause button, because getting all of those turns and twists and loops, that is what is essential for you to figure out exactly how to tie those knots. So the first knot, we'll start with the fly to the tippet or leader. And of course, a leader is the entire piece between your fly line and your fly. Tippet is leader material that gets added in. If you're too pedantic about this, then there's more things to worry about than saying where the tippet stops and the leader starts. The whole thing is a leader. You use tippet material on the tip of your leader. So that knot, in my opinion, the best knot to use is the clinch knot. And this is the standard, once through the eye of the hook, around 6 or 7 times, back through the hole that you created the loop, and then moisten and pull tight. And then snip off nice and close to the eye of that hook. Now, I like the clinch knot more than the improved clinch knot. I have seen studies that say that one is stronger, the studies that say that the other is stronger. If you're using good tippet and you have good knot tying technique, both of these knots can hold up well. The regular clinch knot, I like it because it is a little bit more streamlined and it's one less step. And if you have cold hands or using very, very light line and flies, then this is a very, very good thing to do. Now, a few more notes here as we're talking about tying tippet onto flies, or even tippet to leader. Try to use the amount of tag that you need to tie a fly well. Don't try to minimize the amount of line or leader you're going to have to clip off to the detriment of your being able to tie that knot well. You will get to a good place, especially with a knot like the clinch knot, where you tie that thing up and then you grab that tag end and you're able to pull that knot tightly. And a few things happen when you do this. When you're hanging onto that tag end, maybe between your index and thumb of your left hand, you're pulling on the terminal end of that line with your right hand. I guess it wouldn't be the terminal end, the up towards your rod tip end of the line. Then what you're able to do is a few things. One, you're able to control how you're pulling that line or that leader through the knot, and you are allowing that tag end to be minimized by holding it with your other hand, you're also able to make sure all of those loops and wraps are lining up with one another well. Now, this is how you make sure that you have a nice, strong knot. If you have a knot that's like the clinch knot that has multiple loops where it's wrapping over itself, you want to make sure that those are as uniform as can be. Having a bunched up, bulky knot is a great way to reduce that knot strength. More often than not, if you wrap that thing up real quick, you moisten it, you pull it tight, bam, it's going to line up perfectly. But it's worth paying attention to. Doesn't take a whole lot more work, and it's far superior to then losing a fish or losing a fly because you had one of those loops that was sticking out funny, or because maybe that last loop gets over the tag end of that knot, and now it has the potential to slip through. So out of the clinch knot. Now, if I am fishing a popper or I'm fishing a streamer, fishing a fly that imitates something on the top of the water, and I want that thing to kind of move around a little bit more, or a streamer, I want that to kind of shake back and forth, I'm still probably using a clinch knot more often than not. I know some people who are religious about using loop knots, maybe a surgeon's loop or just a regular loop knot, to attach a streamer or a popper to the end of their leader. I think it works. I am not so convinced that it works well enough to do it every time. I have a lot of success with poppers, especially for warm water fish. I use mice for trout, and I use a clinch knot more often than not. I like to impart the action I want to impart by using my line hand and stripping that fly in. I don't necessarily think I need that extra little percentage of motion that comes from the ability of that fly to kind of swing left to right on that open loop. But you can certainly argue with me. I know a lot of people that swear by using loop knots for these kinds of flies. I personally I don't see the need for it when I'm fishing conventional gear, and I don't see the need for it when I'm fishing fly gear. I feel like I catch plenty of fish and that they're not refusing my fly because of that fly not having as much side-to-side motion. So that's the primary knot is the clinch knot. Now, the next most important knot is leader to leader, or tippet to leader, if you will. I like using a surgeon's knot, particularly when it is at those smaller diameters. So when you're thinking about your leader going from the fly line down to your fly, it goes thick and then thinner and then thinner and then thinner. And if you're using a knotless tapered leader, you can actually feel that as you slide your finger down from the butt of that leader all the way down to the tip where it attaches to the fly. Or if you're using a knotted leader that you either purchased or you tied yourself, of course, you're hitting those segments that get narrower and narrower in diameter as you move down towards your fly. And those knots, especially on those lighter diameter tippets, I like using a double surgeon's loop. Surgeon's loop, it's effectively an overhand knot where you have the line doubled up. Now, there's a few benefits to this knot. One, it's relatively simple to tie. And secondly, it is a nice tight little profile, especially when you are using lighter tippets, when you are down to your 3, 4, 5, 6, and even 7. Now, another knot, and a stronger knot, and an even more streamlined knot is a blood knot. Now, but a blood knot does take a little bit more work to tie. It is not so complicated that it is impossible, and in fact, it is my preferred knot to tie when I am looping together thicker diameter leaders, especially when I am building leaders at home, which I would recommend everyone does. You take all of your leaders that you might want to tie or you anticipate using for that trip or that season, and you tie up a bunch of them beforehand. This is much more economical than buying packaged leaders. It's also a great way to customize what that leader taper is, especially if you're fishing things like small dry flies on glassy water. If you're fishing big streamers, or if you're fishing poppers, you're able to tie leaders that are far superior to anything you can buy in the store. And once you get that material, it's very, very cheap to put this together. So my suggestion to you would be to do that. And if you do that, this is a great way to tie blood knots. You can do that at your tool bench, you can do that at your desk, and you can figure out how to tie them. And once you tie them well at home, then it's a knot that's going to be easier to tie on the stream. That said, I still like to use blood knots on the thicker diameter lines and on most of my saltwater fishing. And then when you get down to thinner diameter tippets, that's when I use that double surgeon's knot. And both knots work great. And again, a lot of times you're going to find that if you tie a good knot, your snaps and your breakoffs are going to happen maybe where that line gets nicked or where that line has been compromised, not so much at that knot. Now, at least in my experience, that's kind of where I am, just with the amount of time I've spent tying knots over and over again. Doesn't mean they're perfect, don't have a 100% success rate, but a lot of my broken line is going to be at where there's been a weak point, where there's been some abrasion, maybe where a fish's mouth has gotten on the fly or on the line, or maybe even where that thing has gotten wrapped around a stick or something, or I've had a tangle. We'll talk about bad knots here in a little bit, and now that line is compromised, or that leader is compromised. I apologize for using line and leader interchangeably. I know in fly fishing that is a cardinal sin, but hopefully you understand we're not tying knots in our fly line, which is an important thing with this next knot, the perfection loop. Now, the perfection loop is a great knot to know how to tie if you are using some sort of interchangeable line and leader system. Perfection loop is a great knot for attaching a bunch of different types of leaders to a fly line, especially if your fly line has that welded loop at the end, or you've created a loop at the end of your fly line. But what this allows you to do is switch up the leader that you're using very, very quickly. So it is not wrong to have a specialty leader, like I said before, for your poppers if you're fishing for bass, and then switch it up and use a different leader if you're fishing a streamer. The same thing is true if you're fishing for trout. Fishing dry flies, have one leader and then another leader if you are fishing streamers. Now, you can modify that tippet at the end of your leader, and you can have a relatively multi-purpose leader that you modify the end within a certain margin of error, and you're able to modify it such that you can fish any kind of fly. But especially if you're fishing very different flies. And another example would be fishing in the salt, and you have you're fishing a popper, and then you want to fish like a streamer. You can switch them out back and forth by using a loop-to-loop system. And so the perfection loop is my favorite knot for this. Again, if I am tying perfection loops on leaders at home, I will hit them with a little bit of UV resin, some knot securing resin. I will put that over that, and then I will zap it with the UV light. And part of the reason for that, well, there's two reasons for it. One, it adds some security, but secondly, it smooths over all of those grooves and bumps in that knot. And once you get to those heavier line weights, those heavier diameters using a more rigid material, then the potential for having some line that sticks up and then could get hung up in your tip top or in your guides, that increases. And so having that knot securing UV resin on there will help smooth that over. That's another benefit of a blood knot. I neglected to mention that. Another benefit of the blood knot is that is usually when you get to those thicker diameters, a smoother profile than a surgeon's loop, double surgeon's loop, when you are tying two pieces of leader together. But another knot that is worth knowing if you are going from fly line to leader, or you're going from fly line to backing, is the nail knot. Now, a nail knot is not an interchangeable knot, it is a permanent knot, but it is a great way to get the smoothest, strongest transition. I say that with a caveat. We could talk about the bimini twist. We could talk about some other knots that are certainly necessary if you're fishing heavy salt or salmon or really, really big fish like that. But for most of the fishing that you're going to be doing, especially in freshwater and light saltwater, having a good, strong nail knot from your leader to your line is a good thing. And again, this is a permanent knot. Once you tie this onto your fly line, you will have to snip off a little bit of fly line to tie another one on, which is okay. You do that, 4 or 5 times over the course of owning a fly line, then you're probably in good shape. You have enough feet on the very tip of that fly line where you can do that before it starts to mess with the taper of that line and its castability. But this is best done with a tool. I mean, I've done it with a straw. I've done it with a plastic spoon. I've done it just freehand when I've been on the water. But it's best done with a nail knot tool. And it's also best done if you do have some sort of resin you can apply to it and really get a nice firm connection. So that's my preferred knot from leader to fly line. So that kind of runs the spectrum. Are there other knots out there? Absolutely. Are there other knots worth knowing? Of course. But those are the knots that I personally have used to great success in 20 plus years of fly fishing, and so wanted to pass them on. But we're going to talk about bad knots here. What are bad knots? Well, bad knot is just tying like an overhand knot to tie your fly onto your leader. But there's other bad knots, and those come in the form of Tangles. Why do you get tangles? And so we'll talk about that for just a few minutes here at the close of the podcast. The two greatest reasons we get tangles. Well, first of all, let me back up. You're going to get tangles. As you are whipping a fly around, you're going to nick something up in the air on your back cast. You're going to go to set the hook on a fly, and it's going to get all jumbled up and on itself, and you're going to get tangles. But the other major reasons why you get tangles are, one, you have a tailing loop. This is when your fly line is collapsing. You have not given it enough energy. And so now as your fly line is going backwards, instead of that fly and leader moving parallel to that fly line, it is looped over and it actually is crossing over itself. And so then when you go to apply power and go forward, that line doubles over and it can actually, that fly will go through that loop that is being created, and now you have what is called a wind knot. We're blaming the wind as if it is the wind's fault. It's really a poor casting knot, but it happens to all of us. So one, if you know that you throw tailing loops, it's important to check your leader often because, as I mentioned earlier, a bad knot, like a regular overhand knot, just in the middle of your tippet section, is now a weak point in your line. Now you have a few options here once you notice that you have a knot like that in your leader. One is it cinched down really tightly? If it's cinched down really tightly, then as I said before, now you have a weak point in your line, and it's probably worth snipping and starting over again. If you really have to get in there with like a hook point to pry that overhand knot open, especially once you get down to 4, 5, 6, 7x, then I would say start over and start with a new piece of tippet, tie that onto your leader, tie your fly back on, and you will have peace of mind. If it is loose enough where you can kind of do it with your fingernails, or if it's a thicker piece of leader material, then by all means pull that thing apart, test it, give it a good solid tug, and maybe even a little bit of a snap and a jerk to see if anything bad happens. If nothing happens, you're probably good to keep fishing. I know that some people spend an inordinate amount of time trying to undo wind knots and undo tangles, and I know how frustrating it can be. I know how maddening it can be, especially if it's a new leader or you just started fishing, you just had to fly on. But it's oftentimes so much better to cut your losses, cut everything off, quickly tie a few knots back together, as opposed to undoing the single wind knot, or as the other leading problem when it comes to bad knots, it's having some sort of multi-fly rig on there and making a bad cast, or maybe setting the hook on a fish and it all kind of comes back in a clump, and the first fly gets tied up in the dropper, and then the split shot kind of spins around the whole thing, and now you have a big mess. The best way to go through fixing this situation, if you want to do it, if you don't want to just cut everything off and count your losses, throw that little wad of tippet in your pocket and throw it away later, is to kind of do the cat's cradle thing. Now, I don't even know what you call it, but you put all the strings between your fingers and you move things around and whatever. That's the best way to undo these tangles, especially if you've just tied on a multi-fly rig with a couple of weights and it's all done up nice and just the way you want it. You notice there's no tight knots there, nothing's been cinched down. Insert a different finger through each loop with one hand, and then using your other hand, start to maneuver things around. Take that trailing fly and start to follow those loops through slowly but surely. Never assume that by pulling it tight, it's going to make it all come undone. We've all done that, where we've had what looks like a knot, but it's really just lots of loops, and you pull it tight and it just pops out. You assume that, there's a very good chance that it's going to start working, and then it's going to fail miserably. So take the time, insert your fingers through loops, get a pair of forceps and help, guide things through. But again, if things are cinched down tight, then that is the time to say, you know what? It's easier to start over. It takes some discipline, especially if you're a new angler. You see what happens with guides. If you ever fish with a guide, you get a tangle, they're going to cut, tie, back on the water super duper fast, as opposed to taking the time to untangle it. Again, if you're fishing with thicker, heavier leader material, then you can really undo a lot of those knots easier. But if you're down to 6, 7x, unless it can come undone very, very quickly, then again, cut your losses. I would say the same thing is true about fishing at night. in my mind, it is, if you get a tangle, you perceive there's a tangle and you're fishing at night, just cut it off and start over again, because the amount of difficulty ratchets up significantly when things are dark, and especially if you start getting cold, you lose your dexterity, you lose your vision, and that is a prime time to get into fish, not to be tying things up. I've actually, a lot of times when I go night fishing, I'll have that second rod rigged up in case I do get a tangle. It's just easier to grab that second rod and start fishing, as opposed to messing with it when I have maybe 20 minutes, 40 minutes of prime fishing opportunities as things get dark. All right, so that is a very, very fast run through knots. So much more information. There is information about knots. There's information about leader construction. There's information about even just how to formulate things so that you reduce, not eliminate, but reduce tangles and knots over at castingacross.com. Put the word leader in the search bar, put the word knot in the search bar, and you will find that stuff, and hopefully it will be helpful to you. This week on castingacross.com, 2 articles. The first one is the website imitating the podcast, and it's called 3+1 Fly Fishing Mini Disciplines. So if you listen to last week's podcast episode, I talked about 3 ways to improve angling efficiency. So I effectively duplicated that, only I added one more for the written word. So if you head to the website, castingacross.com, you'll see 3+1 Fly Fishing Mini Disciplines. So I say very succinctly what I kind of talked about a little bit longer in the podcast, but I also added one in. Wednesday's article was called The Best Last Minute Fishing Gift You Can Plan. The best last minute fishing gift you can plan. Hopefully that's got you scratching your head. That's why I wrote it the way I did. And what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the thing I write about every kind of Advent season, and that is, as you plan to give gifts, one of the best gifts you can give is a fly fishing moment. So I talk about 4 different ways you can do that, ranging in dollar value from 0 to thousands upon thousands. So there's literally something for every budget. It's something you can start planning today, and something you can wait. And if you realize that morning, oh shoot, I forgot so-and-so, you can give them one of these fly fishing gifts. So definitely check out that article over at castingacross.com. This week's recommendation is a watch, all right? It is a watch. It is the Garmin Forerunner, and I've been using this for a few years. How does this help me when fly fishing? Well, maybe I'll write an entire article about it, but it does a few things. One, it tells me what the time is, which is pretty important. But my particular model, I can program it such that it will tell me when sunset and sunrise is. That's a little bit more helpful for hunting than it is for fishing, but it's also helpful just in general. Another thing that I like about it is that there is a feature where I can retrace my steps. I know how far I am from the car, so whether I am running or hiking or walking to where I am fishing, I can see how far I am from the car on my watch, and so I can kind of have a really good gauge of how long it's going to take me to get back. There's lots of other benefits. There's health tracking benefits. I use it for exercising. I use it for a bunch of other stuff. But it is a great thing that if you don't have a watch, don't wear a watch, especially if you exercise, you spend time in the woods. It's a watch worth getting. Not as many bells and whistles as an Apple Watch, but it will definitely do all the things that you need to do if you don't want to be getting, calls and emails on your watch. It does that too, but it doesn't have to. So I'll put a link to the Garmin Forerunner. I think I have the Forerunner Music 245 on this podcast's page over at castingacross.com. Thank you for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and then rate the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.